Hello and welcome everybody to episode 22, Getting Pumped. Kriss and I are here. Welcome, Kriss. We're going to talk about stats, and specifically buffing stats in Camelot Unchained. This isn't really something that we've gotten a ton of new information about or anything. It's just not something we've really discussed much. But it is one of the things that I think, at least at the surface, it looks very different. Dramatically different from most other MMOs, and especially I think is very important for the crafting system and everything, so we're going to talk about it. So to get right into it, the few things we do know about stat buffing in Camelot Unchained is pretty much summarized in 2 points. First, we know that they are not going to have any, or very few, I should say, very few direct buffs to stats. They've just said, since the BSC days, very few. Yeah. Your slave keeps rattling their chain.
It's your dog.
Oh,
with the collar.
Usually she's pretty good and she lays over there, but she keeps getting in the freaking window because it's storming behind me. Which hopefully y'all can't hear. But anyway, they've said since the BSC days, very few direct buffs to stats, which we're going to talk about and get into, because stats, of course, have shaped up a little bit since the BSC days, at least a little bit.
Just a little bit.
It's only been a couple years, and two, we know that there are not going to be any stat buffs on items, on gear. No player stat buffs, I should say, to differentiate from like item stats. Yes, Nanolak. CSE really wants to prevent people from playing classes that are just buff bots. They just run around and are necessary to buff everyone. So, my first question for, of course, chat and Kriss is just to get general impressions. What do you think about that, both when the BSC videos came out and they first announced the concept, and what do you think about it now?
Well, as a crafter, I love it. Actually, because
no stat buffs on your gear. You love that?
Yeah, I do actually, because it's gonna not completely eliminate, but minimize the gear grind, and it's gonna allow crafter to not go for the stats, the best armor, but it will allow crafters to customize the armors depending on the playstyle of each character. So I actually like that there's no character stats buffs on the piece of equipment.
Yeah, Rhaegar says he actually enjoyed having buff bots in Daok, but he can live without them. For myself, for the stats, I actually really like the idea that there won't be stat buffs and everything on gear, because one of the things about MMOs that really drives me up the wall is the gear grind. Just the notion that they essentially gate content based on gear and how much you've ground out new items and new breastplates and everything, and whether or not you have the stats to do stuff, because it gets to the point where you're playing the game and you're level 100 and you can go in there, take off all your gear, and you're useless. I mean, you're completely worthless.
Yeah.
You are nothing but an accumulation of gear and abilities. Your character itself doesn't matter. Whatever you designed or intended for your character really doesn't matter. What's really important is your gear, and that's about it. And I hate that. I feel like a breastplate that walks around. I can't stand it.
Yeah. Well, for me, both actually Rhaegar says about Odzovic says buff bots of buff bots that are actually played. Both actually, because if you don't have a lot of stats buff, there's no point in getting an alt that is just gonna run behind you in auto follow and just be an actual buff bot, basically. Not even just an alt or a player that is just dedicated to buffs, but an actual buff bot, just like a crafting bot that they're trying to eliminate also. So those that's one good thing. And Rahelden, the fact that there's no stat buffs doesn't mean that the stats don't have any influence. It's just that you will have um, choices matters. And yes, as you ask, it is possible to
Hmm.
level the wrong stats and being useless in the way you're playing at the moment. The good thing with the fact that it's horizontal progression is that you can start working on something else, and you will increase that while the rest will be going down. Except for the
Yeah.
stats, if you do if you make the wrong decisions at your character creation, you might regret it.
Hello, Zadrid and Super Dork. Um, that question, first Nanolak, I also hate the gear grind because I do fall behind. I don't like
Me too.
spending tons of time getting new gear. Uh, I have a life. I have I have a full time job
A
and I'm working
job.
on a PhD. I do not have hours of my day to spend grinding gear. Um,
Not anymore.
but for Rahald and for your question, that actually segues very well into my next question that I wanted to ask. Yes, no stat buff at all. So, what exactly will stats influence? My next question: the there are different types of stats, um, and I actually think the BSC video that came out that says, they're not going to buff stats and everything. I don't
Mhm.
want to say it's dishonest, because it's not, and I don't really mean to imply that.
No,
But in a way, it is a little bit deceptive depending on your understanding
misleading.
of it,
Yeah,
because there are three different types of stats. And there are primary stats, which are the stats you choose when you make your character: your strength, your endurance, your attunement, your dexterity, all of that. Those things level through your play progression. As you're playing the game, they get better. As you swing a heavy sword, because you're a melee fighter, your strength is going to get higher. So it's kind of hard to level the wrong stat because you're leveling it by
you're gonna
using it.
use
So if
them.
you like big swords, obviously you're leveling the right stat for it. Also, there are secondary stats, which don't really change. You kind of pick those when you make your character. Those are going to be things like your character's size and mass. Those don't really change throughout the game. Like leveling doesn't really do anything to those
Yeah.
necessarily. Then, of course, there are tertiary stats, which are the results of your other two stats. So those are going to be things like your health pool and so on and so forth. Now, they've said there aren't going to be buffs in the game to stats, but we know that there are in fact buffs to the game. I mean, there's a bard who exists solely to create
Yeah.
buffs. That's their main purpose. So my question is, what things do you think will be buffed? What stats will be buffed
I
in the game?
I think it's not gonna be a purely numerical stat buff, like we see in a lot of buffs where it adds 25 strengths or anything like that. I think it's gonna be more efficiency buffs
Mm-hmm.
more than anything. Like your ratio, increasing your ratio, strength, damage, or things like that, rather than just saying, "Yeah, I'm singing a song and I'm giving you 100 strength." No, I think it's more that your ratio, strength, damage will increase
Mm-hmm.
while you have that buff. So it's not going to be a pure stat buff, but more of efficiency buff.
Yeah, Rahalden says that he thinks this might be bad news for the min maxers. I kind of agree with Rhaegar. I think this is actually fantastic for the min maxers. The
Yes.
difference is you have to do the research for your min maxing before you make your character. Um, so I mean, you can still develop stats as you progress. So if you made a kind of a bad choice, well, you may be able to
It's
offset
going
it
to
with
take longer.
development. But before you make your character, you're going to want to look at guides and go, okay, strength does this. And they've also said that they're going to tell us flat out what the numbers are. One
Yeah.
point of strength does X. 1 point of stamina does Y. So if your 1 point of stamina will result in this many HP, so and so forth. Well, actually, that'd be vitality, not stamina, but that's besides the
Yeah.
point. They don't even have a stamina; it's endurance. But anyway, you get the point. They're going to tell us what those numbers are so that even
Yeah.
before we get in game, you can sit down and people that make guides can sit down and go, okay, if you want the ideal amount of HP, you should probably put this many points of vitality, this many points of strength to get this minimum damage threshold, and so on and so forth, so that you can go in min-maxed already. And then that's not to say you won't be able to do any min-maxing after that, but it's going to be on different things. Instead of your base player stats, character stats, you're going to be looking at things like your weapon damage, your weapon attack speed. Go, okay, well, I stacked tons of strength. Now, is it better for me to have higher damage and slower attack speed, or higher attack speed and less damage, so on and so forth? So that really works out. Now, for stat buffing, I actually kind of disagree with you a little bit, Kriss. I think there will be direct stat buffs. I don't think there will be any. I believe them when they say items will not have any direct stat buffs. So you won't have a sword that gives you any vitality. It's not happening. Yeah. You're not going to have boots. I'm assuming you're probably not going to have boots that give you run speed or anything like that. However, I think some of the classes will have abilities that will directly boost some of the stats. For instance, we know that bards are going to have a run speed buff.
Yeah.
They directly, but I don't think any of the buffs are going to target the primary stats. So strength, they're not going to buff your strength. They're not going to buff your vitality. However, they may buff your HP. Temporary HP buff. Temporary defense buff of some sort. Things like that. I think those will be in the game.
Your disruption damage.
Increase your vision so you can see stealthers. I think we've kind of more or less got confirmation that there are some types of stat buffs from abilities, but they're only to the secondary and the derived stats. One of the key differences, which I think goes into explaining why there aren't so many problems with the min-maxing and stuff, and the primary stats do affect your resulting health and such, but they're primarily a gating mechanic. They're the main gating mechanic for the game. If you have 20 strength, you can't use a greatsword. Whereas if you have 25 strength, you can use a greatsword. So they're the main gating mechanic for some of the higher tiered weapons and things. You'll know what strength you need, or what dex you need, or whatever, and you'll have to have that.
And it's gonna be a good way also to customize the stats and the items for the crafters. Saying I'm more at 20 strength. I need a weapon crafted that allows me to use it. So it has to be. I have a limit of 20 strength, not 25.
Now, let's see. Rhaegar thinks speed and fast attacks is going to be the way to go for this game. I think it's going to kind of depend on what you're targeting.
Yes.
At least I would prefer that it does. For instance, if you're using melee attacks and you're targeting a fighter with heavy armor, I would assume that armor is going to reduce damage from every single one of those attacks. So lots of fast attacks are not going to be ideal against them. So I think there will be some variability in how you design your character and what you want to counter. Let's see. Zadra, the only stat they have confirmed on armor is resistance enchantments on armor pieces from crafters. Essentially, gear is going to have their own sorts of stats, which is why I'm kind of differentiating player stats versus gear and item stats.
Items will have stats, but it's not character stats. It's going to be item stats, melting point, strength,
attack
level
speed,
of level of breakage, things like that.
Sword deflection. I think they mentioned like weapons having a deflection score,
magic deflection, and
shields having some sort of deflection or blocks, thing, that sort of stuff. They're all going to have those different stats, and that's where I think the divide is. I think gear will be able to have increases to those different stats, but that gear's not going to affect the player stats. Whereas abilities probably won't affect the gear stats very much, but will affect the secondary and derived player stats. Let's see.
And I think the buffs, we don't know exactly how much, but they will be part of the skill component system. you will be able to customize to an extent uh, your stat buffs if you're a support class.
Alright, saying I have some issues with the video. I dropped the bitrate down to 1800. That's the same. That's the lowest we've ever used, really. So hopefully that will work a little bit better. That's pretty much what we've normally streamed at. But yeah,
Yes,
the different
those
buffs
are the item engravings.
Yeah, the different buffs are definitely going to be, I think, in the ability creation system because, like again, bards have buffs that they use. They're the main buff class. They're not solely a buff class. They don't want them really considered that, but they're the main class with buffs. So they make abilities. They work on the same system as everyone else, and so they're going to have different buffs, just like the other classes do, that are built within the ability creation system.
Yes.
So of course you can have single stronger buffs. I would imagine different things that you can build that way.
Yeah, better single target buffs, at least more powerful, but only targeting one person. While you might have AOE's that will do less, that are less powerful but impacting more people.
Now, for people that are interested in crafting, and obviously for Kriss, I wanted to ask: Do you think? I mean, they've said that there's not going to be stat buffs on items.
Yes.
Do you think they're going to have to rescind that in some way? Do you think in any way that is needed for crafting and for items? Because I have had people ask me, like, isn't that going to be a problem for people getting gears if they don't have any kind of stat buffs on them? What's the point?
Well, the point is trying to punch somebody who has a heavy armor instead of going with a hammer that will have the hammer will not buff your strength, but you can have a hammer that will have actually more disruption damage, or that will have more impact damage, or that's going to be the stats and the difference between different items. You will have, for example, a shield that will have more resistance that can be engraved, or even the inner stats of the shield that would be resisting more to magic, or resisting more to cutting, or to piercing. All those stats will be modifiable while you're crafting the item. So even if the gear doesn't give your character stats, the stats that are inherent to the gear will be extremely important also.
Now, Rahalden asks, but shouldn't buffs be some sort of constant? Because a fighter has to be sure buff A gives X% of attack speed. No, I don't think they do. For a couple of reasons. One, you're not always going to have those buffs. Not everyone's going to have those buffs. So you're not always going against. One of the problems with buff bots, with characters that do nothing but go around buffing everyone, and they can buff as many people as they want. Everyone has the buffs. So at that point, there is no point to the buffs. If everyone has an attack speed and a health buff, what purpose do they serve? They don't really serve any purpose except requiring you to have the buff. So the way this works is buffs are going to be more limited. You can, like, the bard is going to have a limited range. He can only buff so many people. So he's not going to be able to go, okay, everyone on my realm has an attack speed buff, and then the other realm's going to have someone who does the same thing. So instead, whether or not you have a certain buff is going to be largely dependent on your group composition and your play style. I don't think there's going to be a ton of buff staffing on different things, and that actually leads very well. Again, you're doing good with this. To my next question, bards are specifically the buff class. They don't want them to be called that. They don't really want them to be thought of as the buff class because they don't want that to be all that they can do. But they can buff. We've seen example abilities for them. They can buff several different things. They can buff your movement speed. They can debuff damage. They can do all kinds of stuff. So, but if there are a lot of things if they don't want them to be a buff class and they don't want there to be lots of different things that they can buff, does that mean that they're essentially just going to end up being another DPS class? Because they can't be a tank, they can't be a healer, because the only healers can heal.
Yeah,
and the devout a
but
little bit.
they will be a hybrid class, a bit like the devouts. Only the devouts are more healer for some of them, more healer DPS or more mage DPS. The supports are gonna be also probably support DPS. So they're gonna have enough DPS to be somewhat to have somewhat of a survivability, but their main purpose is you can't go around and say, yeah, you won't have only the role of buffing, but if they don't do that, they're just another class and they don't
Yeah.
have a lot of utility outside of that.
Do you think? Do you think the bards are going to have? I know they haven't. They've talked about how there's not a lot of CC they've put out, but bards
At
to me
least hard
seem like a
CCs.
class that could be very viable having some of the crowd control. Do you think that's going to be
Yes.
a thing to help
That-
offset the lack of different things that they can buff?
yes, I think it could be a good idea since we know that they're gonna try really hard to not have any hard CCs, but they might have soft CCs. Um, the bards are probably the class to have it.
Now, I think Glackens actually made a very good point that boons are the only constant buffs, and
Yes.
that actually goes very well with Rahalden's question. I mean, if a fighter wants to make sure that he has plus X% attack speed, he probably wants a boon for that, and
Yeah,
there
but
may very well be boons
that
for
means
that.
he will have to take a debuff, a permanent debuff, to counter that.
Yeah, you'll have to take some kind of bane in, but
Yeah.
there will be some possible permanent boons and thus
Yes,
buffs that you can get for your character in that fashion.
and that
Uh,
not everybody will have, and therefore making them actually relevant.
and again, playing directly towards that min-maxing playstyle
Yes,
that a lot of
also.
people enjoy. You get to pick your stats up front, then you get to pick your boons and banes to min-max how you want, and then when you get in-game, then you have to worry about min-maxing the gear, essentially.
Yeah, and those boons, banes, stats, all that will play something that I don't especially like, but you will have inside the classes the flavor of the month archetypes, because there is so many different ways to play a class and to build a class that you will have people saying that's the best way to do it, even
Mm-hmm.
if it's not necessarily for all situations. But uh, people who want to have a heavy fighter skirmisher, there will be a guide and a build to do that. You will have the heavy fighters for sieges. All those will have very dedicated stats distributions and boons and banes to take to be able to be the most effective for that.
Rahalden is asking if there are multiple buffs of the same type. Do they stack? Does one overwrite the other? Like if you get a speed buff of 10% and then a speed buff of 15%, do they stack or overwrite? We don't really know for sure.
No, but I
We
prefer they
do know.
override each other.
I'm gonna say based on what we do know that probably the most powerful one would override.
Yes.
And the reason I say that is because we do know that the Arthurian Bard song buffs do
Mhm.
stack, and it specifically
Yes.
says that for the class. So I'm assuming for other people that is not the case. It will not stack on top of each other.
Yeah.
We do know that the Arthurian minstrel
Part,
can
minstrel, yeah.
have some level of stacking with their buffs. I think it's got like diminishing returns or something probably. But there can be overlap and stacking effects specifically with them. So for most other classes, the buffs probably don't stack. You probably just get whichever one's the best. Let's see.
Uh, Let me see what the chat does, because the chat is. I'm glad the chat is really active today.
Yeah.
Um, I want to come back to one of the previous statement from Olvik and Rygar about the items, and especially Olvik saying that I can see stat buffs that would allow you to equip a weapon which will
Yeah,
wear off after a set time. You can't build your character around the buffs because you might not have them all the time, and
yeah,
so yeah, you will have to build your items and your gear towards the stats, both the stats you want, and maybe if you're going gearing toward a different build after a time, getting the gear that is geared more toward that goal also. And yes,
yeah.
Glacken's boons and banes will have to balance out.
Oldovic asked, "What if bards have a balance have to balance a boon, a bane with their buff as part of their buffs?" Now that would be interesting. Like if they could cast a buff that also had a bane attached with it. I think that would be very counterintuitive, though. Like on the one hand, I feel like that could be a cool system. Like with the ability
Yeah,
modification, you could go, okay, well, I want an extra, like maybe the normal buff's fine, but then I want like an extra powerful buff, but I have to attach this little penalty with it for you. I'm sorry. But on the other hand, I feel like you would really be probably kind of screwing out a lot of people if you did that. Because how do you pick and choose? Unless you really knew your party and what kind of combat style they were going for, I think there would be a really great opportunity to really annoy a lot of people doing that. And
yeah, maybe
that could be a way to kind of troll your own people too, because then you could attach
maybe
that to your own abilities
having a
and go
boon.
around debuffing your whole group.
Yeah, having a boon and a bane, or multiple boons and banes that give you access to different components for your spells. That you have to have that boon or that bane to have access to that component.
And yeah, the video in the middle is just one of the recent animation building things they've done during their hot streamy summer. I just wanted to say something like that. I just put it up in the middle since there's only two of us. I thought it would be fun to watch something. That may be part of the reason we're having frame rate issues. I don't know. Because I'm loading a video at the same
Apparently,
time.
Zermus is a big fan also of the idea of buff that come with a forced bane.
I mean, it could be interesting. It would depend on how they did it. I'm a little worried that people would use that to troll their own teammates in their own realm. Um,
Mm.
but I could see it maybe
No,
only,
because
like Glacken said,
that would
only
be,
if the original buff is really powerful. And then you go,
yeah.
okay, well, you're getting a
Because
really
you
powerful
can't
one,
really
but
troll.
this is
You
going to
couldn't
suck.
really troll your teammates because the bane is not attached to the buff. It's attached to the bard. If he wants to have access to that buff, will have to take the bane at
Now,
his
that's it.
character creation.
Now, that's an interesting idea. If maybe instead of taking it actually at character creation, what if the bard could do stronger buffs to other players, but when they cast it, it applies a penalty to himself, kind of
Yeah,
like
that would work also.
I think it's the TDD healer loses
Yeah.
life to heal other
Yes.
people.
He uses
So
his own life
some of
to
the
heal
bards could
people.
go around and be like, okay, I'm going to give you a super buff, and I've just dropped HP by 50% or something, or
Yeah.
movement speed just dropped down, and then maybe when he dies, the buff goes away. So just be very careful about when he actually throws that out.
But
Uh,
one thing I would really like to see, um, and it's kind of counterintuitive, especially for a crafter that wants to make money. But we talked about the critical builds where you have
mhm.
some RNG and you make an epic item. Those powerful items, I want them to have limitation, as in you need to have either that stat or that boon or bane to be able to equip and use the weapon and the gear.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Rahalden, the primary stats, kind of what you're referring to, the primary stats are definitely primarily a gating mechanic, but they are also for getting gear, so you have to have X strength to use Y weapon. But they are also a part of the third classification of stats, the derived stats, which are things like your health pool, your I think movement speed is a derived stat too.
I
Um,
I'm not sure actually.
I'm not sure, but I think it is. But
Yeah.
there's like 6 or 7 derived stats that are all
Hmm.
based on the primary and secondary stats pulled together to make them and determine what that number is. And I think we'll see abilities that directly buff secondary stats and derived stats separately, depending on what the buff does.
And Rygar, the question is, how can you get ahead of other player if everyone has an advantage? It isn't an advantage anymore. Yes, and that's why I think they were saying that they don't want too much stat buffs
Yeah.
because you have to make a choice, and you will be better than than most people in some if you sacrifice in other areas.
Yeah, and that's the I think that's the main thing, and why they even said during the bard reveal, people were like, "Oh, it's the buff class." They were like, "We don't want this to be a buff class. This is not the buff class. We do not want them called the buff class." They have buffs, and they're the main class that does have buffs, but I don't think they want them to have a lot of different buffs. Uh, that they can just pump out all the time, because then you do run into that problem where if everyone's got buffs, so what's the point?
Yeah.
Instead, it's going to be, and they're going to be limited, so they can only cast buffs over a short range or for a certain amount of time. Um, and otherwise, they're probably going to have to either have, and we kind of touched on that earlier, crowd control abilities and or damaging abilities, which we've seen some damaging abilities with them too. They've got some song effects and or ranged attacks or melee attacks. Uh, I figure bards will probably end up spending half their time doing damage and half their
Yeah.
time buffing people to keep the
Mm,
class interesting.
maybe I would be more geared toward 70-30 buffing DPSing, because
70%
otherwise they're just
DPSing or 70% buffing.
70% buffing, because
Eh,
otherwise they're just
that's a lot
another
of buffing though.
DPS class. Yes, but that's, they don't want them to be called buff bots, but at the same time that's what they are. They're a buffing class. They're a support class. They're not healers. They're not DPSs. There's not mages. They have to have a real purpose other than just average DPS and being a Swiss Army knife.
You don't
They're
think
not.
being
They're
the only class with buffs is a real purpose, even if they
then
only
then
spend half their time doing
then
that?
you are a dedicated buffer. You're not a DPS. You're a buffer.
Well, that's what I said though. I just said I think I can see them doing it half the time, and then half their time they're doing damage. I think if they're spending more than half their time doing damage, at that point they're a buff bot. Um, Somebody's going to create a
Mm,
script to make them follow their character around and have 2 accounts and have them spamming their buff on them all day long, and that's what they're going to do. And that's what they want to avoid. So I think one of the best ways they can do that is to not have them. I'm not saying they won't have a lot. They won't have buffs, but to not have them doing that all the time, and especially they have to make it not essential. If the
but
buffs are essential to
then
have,
that's
there's
the
no
same
point.
as having a heal bot. Then healers shouldn't have significant heals and be DPSing 50% of the time, because otherwise somebody will make a script to have a healer following them and healing them.
But with
That's the same.
healers, they're making them have targeted abilities, whereas the
Yeah,
bards, several of theirs are AOE abilities.
yeah, but
Like their music sounds are going to be kind of like an aura effect. Now, not necessarily all their buffs
yeah.
work that way. They may have some that are targeted. We don't know exactly how that's going to work, but at least some of them are AOE style
Yeah. And
buffs.
Ulrich asked if we will see buffs on potions. We don't really don't know a lot about consumables
Yeah, they haven't
at
really
all.
talked about that much.
But honestly, I would like to see if we have potions. I would like to see potions having both a buff and a debuff effect.
I would prefer not to see any buffs on potions. Instead, I would prefer to see consumables used to reduce recovery time. So when you're outside of combat, reduce the time it takes you to heal and recover stamina and everything.
Outside combat.
Yeah, outside of combat stuff. So you can get out, chug a potion, or eat a steak real quick. Your health goes back to full, so then you can go out there and play the game faster rather than having to sit there for a minute and go.
No combat buffs for consumables. Basically.
I would prefer that.
Okay.
Because then they kind of shift the focus around. Okay, we don't want mandatory buff bots. Instead, we're going to give you potions that you have to buy. And everyone has them.
Yeah.
That just becomes kind of a little bit redundant. Thank you, Nanolag. Movement speed is a derived stat, so that's a third in the third group.
It's okay, Zeramus. I'm always right anyway. We established that in the previous debates anyway.
But that's the thing, Zeramus. They didn't want it called a buff class. They said it's not a buff class. They said, no, don't call it a buff class.
It's a support class.
Well, and it can support. There are other ways to support. Damage is a support. I'm supporting your damage with more damage.
That's pushing it a bit far, I think.
Maybe a little bit. They do also have debuffs, too, though. So that is a thing.
I would rather see them doing 50% buff and 50% debuffs.
Yeah, I think I wasn't counting debuffs in with that 50% buff, so I think they will spend.
For me, I would prefer 40% buff, 40% debuff, and 20% DPS.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I don't want to see them spending most of their time doing damage because they're a support class. They're not. It's not really what they're supposed to be doing. I think they're obviously going to have to do some, but
yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to catch back up with the chat here. Glycons point out Arthurian healer, soothing elixir reduces panic. They aren't the only ones with buffs. Some of the other classes do have buffs or debuffs of some sorts. The Viking Scout has several debuffs. So they're not the sole source of buffs. They just gonna have the most of them.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Well, we really have no idea what consumables will be.
Yeah.
Well, we know that most healers will have consumables, potions for the alchemists, for the physicians, stones for the stone healers. The TDD don't really have any consumables for their heals. Well, yeah, their health. It's their consumables. Their hit points.
Odovic did have a good point about buffs. Essentially, kind of the point about the healer, you know. If the buffs are not strong enough, that having basically the buffs have to be pretty powerful, because otherwise there's no point to take a bard versus taking another character. There has to be a reason to take the bard.
Or another healer that can either cure you from a debuff or just heal you in general.
Yeah. I mean, I think the speed buff is going to be a big part of it, because I think there are a lot of reasons you would want to take a speed buff.
You would like at least having a bard to bring your troops to the battlefield.
Yeah, but that can't be the only reason. I mean, there has to be other reasons to take them.
That can then, because otherwise they're just a human mount, basically.
Yeah. I'm going to call you the horse. Come on, horse. Come on. Get us going. I would actually like it if consumables had some kind of a limit to them to make them harder to carry. Harder to carry tons of them, you know. So a potion or food or something. And maybe that could be the purpose of consumables, you know, when or if they ever add food and drink to the game. Potions can be kind of bulky. You have to chug around this pint-sized potion around.
Yeah.
That takes a little bit of inventory space.
So
exactly.
Getting your consumables and bringing them to the battlefield detracts from other things.
Whereas a steak, a little bit lighter. It doesn't take up as much space.
Yeah. And
I don't see damage potions. I mean, I guess they could. They could make some kind of crafter-made damage potions. But at that point, you're kind of talking about crafter traps.
No.
A little bit.
What I prefer to see, if you talk about consumables, oils like in The Witcher that you apply to weapons that gives an effect to either the first or the first couple hits of your weapon. more
I can
than
see that.
actual potions that you can drink and have a duration. And Ozovic
Zermus,
asks, will crafter benefit from bard buffs? No, I don't want to see that. I don't want to have a bard singing in my ears while I'm crafting. I prefer having my buffs from the crystals on my Vox or from my uh actually from my gear that I'm crafting.
well,
But
I think the crafters are gonna have to have some sort of combat abilities, like 10%,
yes,
you know.
yes,
So
they will,
in that way, they will get some sort of
yes,
benefit from
but
them.
not for the crafting part.
But while they're crafting, that would be weird because then
No,
you'd have to be like, I want to make an epic helm. Come here, bard. Come and sing for me.
sing for me.
Sing for me while I make. Actually, I think that could be kind of cool though. Like to maybe improve your chances or something a little bit.
Yeah,
You
but
could pay a bard to
that's
come hang out
the
with you.
point of
That could be
the
kind of
crystals
cool.
on your Vox Magus.
I'm
That's
just saying, I don't
the
think it would be terrible, but
yeah.
I wouldn't want it to be a thing you had to do all the time. That would be kind of crazy.
And
For
yeah,
Zeramus, he's
caravans
asked,
will be probably the way to get your consumables to the battlefield.
yeah. Zeramus asked why not have the bards do 20% healing instead, because they're not supposed to be a healing class.
The
I mean,
devout
they are
the
a support,
devout
but
will be more of an off heal.
they did say that healers are supposed to be the only healers. So
Yes.
if they start handing a lot of classes heals,
Nah.
that's going to be kind of
Devouts
pointless.
have
Normally,
some
I
sort
would
of
say
heal
yes.
already, so I don't want
Yeah,
to see
exactly.
another class.
And Devout also have buffs.
Yeah,
So Devout are really kind of the hybrid between the Bard and the
the
healer
real
already.
hybrids. Yeah,
They have the Bard
damage,
buffs a little
buffs,
bit, some of
and
the
heals.
heals a little bit, and then damage.
Yeah.
The Bards, I think, are on the opposite end of that spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bards can make crafters run faster. I'm fine with that. The moment the fight breaks, I'm grabbing the bard and I'm out of there. I let the fighters do the fighting, and I'm out of here.
Zeramos has a Bard song from FF11 burned into his head and will play the day he dies in real life. I like having bards in different games. I think they're fantastic. I really kind of hope they do something with the musical component of it beyond just you have an instrument and there when you use a certain ability it goes and then that's it. I would love to see some really kind of BSC level to that. I don't know. I kind of doubt they're going to have time to do it, but
they could do it the way Arche does it. You create a file that plays a song inside the game.
that's not going to be abused at all.
Yeah. And
do they have people to admins to either approve or deal with all the harassment from that?
Yeah, Rhaegar says Song of Stealth. That's kind of weird. I'm making noise
sneak up on the ogre. Yeah, Physician and Stone Healer can do some CC. There are buffs and crowd control abilities stuff spread out very thinly over a lot of different classes. Bards are essentially, I think, the nexus of buffs and debuffs. They're going to have more than everybody else, but by far they're not going to be the only sources. And I think it's really important that they're not, because there need to be some buffs and things that can come from other classes. So if you don't have a bard, you're not completely out of luck. And also, while the bards can still be useful, they don't become this absolutely 100% essential thing that I think they're trying to avoid having. What class is the anti-buff? Stripping buffs? Actually, the bards are. I think at least one of the bards has an example ability that strips buffs.
Yes.
So I think the bards will be buffing and removing buffs and debuffing, and then hitting people with their loot.
I would say some healer abilities should help with the debuffs. At least the debuffs related.
I think
to health.
there might be some healer abilities that remove buffs too, and I think there might be some scouts that do it too. Well, at least one maybe that
Yeah.
removes it. I'm not sure.
I think scouts have some debuffs, not cures, but debuffs.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. I think maybe
Yeah.
one of the scouts has something to remove a buff from somebody.
Hmm.
I think the people most suited to do that are stealthers,
Yeah.
scouts, and bards, and maybe healers to remove buff from people. I think those
Yes.
are the main ones that would make the most sense
That's the
doing
main
that.
ones. Yeah.
But I also think one of the main counters to buffs is killing the bard, because their bard song is usually an active effect. I think some of the buffs aren't, but I think the aura type style ones they do are active. They have to maintain it, and then it plays for a little
Yeah.
bit. So if you kill the bard, that goes away.
That I am. I know there it's not gonna be like that, but I would love to see a return of the song Twitch, and it was actually a bug from the game, from the developers, that they left in the game because people began to master it. But in EverQuest, the best bards could Twitch four songs at the same time, because the songs were I think something like 5 seconds long, so the buff was only during for 5 seconds after you stopped playing it, and the best bards would be able to keep four songs up all the time, and that was quite a feat. The average bard would be able to do two. The good ones would be able to keep three up, but the really great one could have four.
Yeah, I think there are definitely occasions where unintended effects in games should be left in because they just make the
Yeah.
game better. Whereas there
Hmm.
are times when they really need to be taken out. And no, Zero,
Yes.
you're not supposed to say I'm right because they said only healers are healers. You can instead say I'm right because I'm always right. Some of the time, anyway. I'm 100% correct at least 50% of the time.
And yes, Aldovic, killing somebody is kind of silencing them anyway. So yeah.
I've got a debuff for you. My last question. Hello, CSE
Hey
Mark.
Mark.
It's been a while since we've seen you on here.
Yeah.
A little while, anyway, I think. Um, my last question I wanted to bring up for the buffing system is, as we've kind of said, the BSC video kind of goes like no stat buffing, especially on items, no stat buffing.
Yeah.
As we've said, there's obviously some stat buffing for secondary and derived stats. So, is there really anything especially notable about this that makes it BSC that we need to leave off on?
Um.
Heck, the
Good
silence
question.
reigns.
Good
I mean,
question.
because some people have made an issue of it. That's why I mentioned it. Some people have
Yeah.
gone like, "Oh God, well, that's weird. That's just totally crazy." And then, but now that we talk about it,
Yeah.
is it really? Is it so
It.
cray cray?
I.
Oh God!
Honestly, I,
Got
I
him a
actually
video.
love the idea of not having stats on stat buffs on the items, and limited stat buffs on the from buffs. So yeah, I don't think it's that much of a BSC idea. I think it's a welcome change from
Mm-hmm.
the stat. I think you can call that stat creep. Um, trying to increase your stat infinitely with gear, with buffs, with consumables. Um, After some point, it becomes all about the stats and not about the gameplay, because the stats are the defining factors, and
Mm-hmm.
it should not be. Skill of the player and coordination of your team should be the defining factors more than your stats.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the only part of this that is kind of BSC that people really need to can take away from this, I guess, uh, is the no stats on gear. I think that no player stats on gear. I think that is the biggest part of it, and it's the part that really is impactful for me. It's one of the reasons I backed the game. I did not want to see any player stats on the gear. I didn't want to see any strength, any dexterity or any buffs like that on the gear, so then I have to grind gear to power up my character. Because as we've said, I hate feeling like a walking breastplate. I don't want that in the game. I don't want them to be, oh, this armor has +5 strength, whereas mine only has +3. Oh, I gotta get that armor. No, I don't want to do that. And since that isn't going to be a part of the game, I think that is the most BSC part, because that's in almost every MMO. Almost every MMO, especially with crafted gear, they have that. That's the crux of the economy and the progression in the game. You have to get that gear, whether it's PvP or it's PvE.
Become obsolete so early, because after that the drops, the crafting cannot keep up with the stats from the drops, from the raids, from everything.
I agree in that lack. The lack of theme park mechanics on like stats on everything is the BSC. It's one of the most BSC things in the game.
Yes.
Is its complete departure from the theme park concepts. I mean, there are a lot of older MMOs that don't have those theme park issues, but over the last 5 years or so, it just seems like everything has wanted at least a little bit of theme park in it. It's like the sleazy guy kind of sneaking up to you, like, come on, you got to have a little bit of theme park in you.
Yeah.
You can't go out without any theme park. Everybody loves a little bit of theme park. Getting rid of the theme park. I hate the theme park. I wish the games would either go nothing but theme park or leave the theme park out. And I think that is the most BSC idea that we've got going on here. I miss a few chat points here. Rahalden, should other classes besides bards be able to buff or be able to debuff or silence, because that would break the dependence on other classes, which CSE isn't happy to. I don't understand the question, actually. I think they are happy to break a dependence on classes. I think they want you to not be dependent on any one class.
That's kind of what he meant, I think. He was asking if other classes should have some of those abilities to not have to depend on bards. I don't agree with that. I think, again, we always come back to the same thing. Choices matters. If you don't take a bard in your group, you're gonna have to adapt your gameplay to the fact that you don't have a bard in your group, and then your tactics are gonna be different. The way you're playing, the way you prioritize your targets is gonna be different. So no, I think you don't have to be dependent on it, but it has to have a very specific role that you have to adapt to the fact that you don't have it if you choose to not take it.
I think that I actually kind of agree that it should be stratified a little bit. I don't think they should be stratified to the point where bards aren't useful. That's the thing. But I think they should have some of the buffs and debuffs and counter to the buffs and stuff spread out to some of the other classes, to where not having a bard will be very noticeable, but it's not something you can't get by without. Because I don't think any class except maybe healers should be something that you absolutely can't get by without. And even healers, that kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're doing a roaming DPS group, you may not want a healer with you because they're slow and they have the heals, but you may not need the heals. You may be trying to burst people down,
do a lot of damage, and get out. You don't really need a healer for that.
Now they're having an interesting conversation here about how buffs might interact with air. Odovik asked,
would be interesting.
Wouldn't they need some kind of a physical in-game shape, since all the abilities are physical? And they have said all abilities are physical entities. That means buffs are also kind of physical entities in the game. At least I would assume they are.
Buffs, especially for bots, buffs are sound.
Yeah.
If you blow a tornado or something that overcomes that sound, or create void where sound cannot go, it might be able to debuff to cancel the buff.
Yeah, and CSE Mark said that spheres could make like a spherical field that other things going through could interact via the air system. So it's not something we would necessarily see, but that's with all the abilities. We don't necessarily see that the flame wall has a certain area that it encompasses, except for the flame effects that we see. But those shift around. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not a square. We just.
And Ulvik says, I'd love to see 99% of the equipment to be non-magical, and the magical gear being few and far between. 100% of the gear will be non-magical. 0% of the gear will be magical. The magic is gonna come from the ears system, from the engraving. The gear itself will not be magical. It will have its own properties, but the magic itself is gonna come from the engravings.
That's true. It's kind of a fine distinction, though,
It
because
is,
because I think the
if
thing
your gear
he
doesn't
would be
have
saying.
engravings on it, it's not gonna be a magical weapon.
Yeah, well, I think the thing he's saying though in that context is he wants 99% of the gear to not have engravings. That would be my guess, anyway.
Okay.
I would say 99% might be a little much, but I can kind of agree. I can kind of agree with the sentiment though, like that most of their gear is not magical all the time. They don't all have engravings. So when someone does have a sword with the cool engravings, then it's like, oh, that's a good sword. I think that could be cool. Yeah, I could agree with that. Rare, maybe not 99% rare.
Yeah, rare. Yeah,
but
it will all depend on how expensive in materials, in magic, in maybe stats usage, stat debuff. The fact that you have an engraving on your weapon might make it magical and more powerful. But the moment you hit something like a shield or another weapon, it has a higher chance of breaking. Things like that.
What happens when a heavy metal bard plays with a country music bard? Someone cringes. That would be my guess.
Yes. Most definitely.
Somebody's going, oh, God. We could have a quesomancer that has cheese smells drift downward. I want a quesomancer. I'm going to say that right now. That is one of my favorite things. God, I want Mexican food now. What are you doing to me? I was going to make some barbecue pork, and now you're mentioning queso.
Crafting is magic doesn't mean you make magic items. You use magic to shape materials. You don't make magic items.
That is very true, and it is an important distinction.
Yes, it is.
Crafting tables are magic. He's trying to trick you
on me. That's not gonna work.
They get a Grammy. They could get a Grammy too.
Metal plus country getting a Grammy, then the Grammys decreased a lot in quality.
Especially if it's got country in it. I don't listen to that crap. I'm gonna be biased right now. I don't want to listen to any of that.
Yeah.
I live in the South. I have to hear plenty of it accidentally.
And I want, if you have a quesomancer, I want it to have a bomb that adds panic whenever you throw it just from the smell. Everybody has to flee from the area.
Stinky cheese bomb. Alright, let's see who else is here. We got a number of people that came in. Barrett Tech. Hello, Barrett. Hi, Mark. Beyond the Gray. Alexis, I already said hi to. Oldovik. Thraxter, yes. Zadrids, and I said hi to Zero most earlier, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
You want to see who else we've got here and say hi again? Seems like we've mostly run out of questions. So I do want to put out some announcements and everything first before we just continue our general banter and conversation as we usually do. Which is, as a reminder to everyone, we are changing channels for the show. I'm typing in the chat right there. You can click on my name, Abducted Gaming. Eventually, we're going to move over to that channel. So if you want to go ahead and subscribe over there, that would be fantastic. I'm going to kind of gauge how many subscribers we have and when I think enough people have switched over so that everyone will get notifications and won't be completely lost. Then we'll switch to the new channel. Essentially, the Continuum Complex channel, first of all, the name's just weird. This was a Twitch channel I made just to watch stuff. It wasn't originally intended to broadcast, so I made a channel specifically for the cast and for videos and gameplay and stuff, so that I can switch to that, and it'll make a little bit more sense as a gaming channel instead of Continuum Complex. Hopefully, Abducted Gaming is a little bit more memorable.
Yeah.
On a similar note, let me see if I can type this here. I think that's how I get to it. Let me try that.
I would love
See if
that,
it works.
Ulrich. Will
There we
bards
go.
have a range of musical instruments, tubas, trombones, violins,
I hope
etc.?
so. Yeah.
Yes.
Also posting in the YouTube channel where we're uploading all these videos. If you want to catch it later or catch some of the older videos, you can go on there, youtube.com/c/Vellic. I changed the URL a little bit because it was like a god-awful string of numbers that YouTube gives you automatically. I finally got enough views that I could change the channel name to at least that. So you can go back. I've started to put up some actual gameplay videos of different stuff, like me playing Fallout and stuff, so you can catch those too. So I do want to thank everybody for coming out.
Yes.
And we will have another episode in 2 weeks. Usual, same time. Saturday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 GMT. Thanks everybody for coming out. And I will catch you all in 2 weeks or whenever you watch the YouTube video and maybe comment.